Welcome to the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson, and I'm here on Zoom with Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner. What's been happening musically with you guys since we last met? Charlotte, what have you been up to?
Well, it's been mostly a week reviewing CDs, which has been rather nice, actually. All sorts of really nice stuff. Particularly, Frank Peter Zimmermann has just brought out this wonderful new disc of the two Martinu violin concertos. I mentioned Martinu 2 last week, but I can't get it off my stereo. It's quite addictive stuff, and I think because it's just not repertoire that we're really listening to that much. So I've been doing that, and also I've been going down memory lane. I'm finally writing up my cover feature for the Stratford Quatuor Modigliani, and I'm back there in Bremen in the concert hall there with all 200 of us in this 1,200 seater hall, and just reliving the emotions of that, hearing Schubert's quintet in this bizarre rehearsal acoustic. So it's been a very nice, I would say slightly isolated week, but it is lockdown, so I can't really complain too much about that.
No, okay. Richard, what about you?
Well, last Tuesday was the 100th anniversary of the CBSO's, what they call their inaugural concert with Edward Elgar in Birmingham 1920. And they planned huge celebrations, big concerts. There was going to be a big event in Birmingham Symphony Hall, which had a complete programme, was all going to be reenacted, note for note. Huge celebration. Obviously, all completely screwed up by lockdown 2, completely out the window. They recorded a much shorter programme behind closed doors with no audience. They did that last week, and only this week did BBC Radio 3 manage to find a slot to broadcast it. And they were kind enough to ask me to say a few words about the history of the orchestra. So that was it's always fun to work with the BBC. It's sort of this has been 100 years coming, but they remembered to ask me on Friday afternoon, and that was my weekend. Really, could I please write a script and record it before Tuesday for them? Very, very urgent. Please, it was absolutely lovely. I mean, a pleasure to work with these guys, of course. They're a terrific bunch. The main issue was that I kept getting the official BBC pronunciations wrong and having to be corrected by the producer. So, yes, apparently it's Gerontius, the dream of Gerontius. If I said Gerontius, apparently that would have provoked angry letters, which I can well believe.
Yes.
so yes, I didn't want that to happen to them. Then later on in the same paragraph, I mentioned the Spanish artist Velázquez. I said, well, how do you want that pronounced? Oh, that doesn't matter.
Okay.
Apparently. Anyway, always a pleasure and always an insight to work for the lovely people at the BBC. And
of course,
it was nice to be part of it, even when it's reduced and slightly disappointing, slightly sadder version of the great celebration we did have planned.
Yeah. I've had a real pleasure of a week in that I received my copy of Malcolm Arnold's Fifth Symphony score in the post. So I've been going through all of that, which I love that piece, as we talked about it very much last week. And because of Charlotte, also one of the worst musical experiences of the year, because it out-plopped this extraordinary Christmas album by Jonas Kaufmann, the last track of which is him singing, well, I mean, I suppose we could call it that, All I Want for Christmas, the Mariah Carey song. And Kaufman, in his wisdom, decided to record this. And we've all been listening to it, haven't we? It's one of those so bad it's good experiences. No, it isn't. But it's definitely something that needs to be maybe experienced just once. But what was the great pleasure of it was having put it up on Facebook and recommended to everyone that they don't listen to it. People were piling in with other great examples of classical singers, opera singers particularly, doing pop music. And then Gillian Moore from the South Bank Centre, the previous guest on this programme, then put up something I will never forgive her for, was this extraordinary performance by 4, it was obviously an encore, of 4 opera singers in Vienna, and we know what a laugh they have, singing Last Christmas, George Michael's Last Christmas. And that is even more horrendous than the Kaufman Christmas track. So thank you very much for that, Gillian. But, oh man, what an assault on the ears that was. But please, anyone listening, don't go and find it. You will regret it. Just don't go and find it. Anyway, so some mixed experiences this week. Let's get onto our subject for this week. And it is top 5 personal moments in music. Slightly different way of doing things this week. We're talking about those crucial moments in our lives that perhaps changed things or had a massive influence on our subsequent careers. So a very personal one this week. And we're all musicians here of one sort or another, but with very different paths to our careers, none as actual professional musicians, but we do have one of those with us. And it is our very special guest, the principal flute and former chairman of the London Symphony Orchestra, who's also a broadcaster and an author. It's Gareth Davies. Gareth, welcome.
Thank you, Tommy. It's nice to be here.
Well, thank you ever so much for doing this. I'm really looking forward to hearing your top 5 moments that have brought you to where you are today, and that is in your music room talking to us. But what I'd quite like to do first, though, it's a very sad week actually for the London Symphony Orchestra family, isn't it? Because of the death announced yesterday morning of Devorah Lewis, the sort of queen of classical music PR, who was represented the LSO for 37 years and many more artists besides. Would you be able to just give us a few words, because you were chairman, as I mentioned, of the orchestra as well? You knew Devorah very well. Just a few words maybe on Devorah?
Yeah, I mean, it's as you say, it's a really sad day. I mean, you only need to go on social media to see the outpouring of love for Devorah from everyone in all corners of the music business, because she was just one of those people. I mean, to say she was held in high regard by the LSO is an understatement. She was loved. She was the word family gets used in arts marketing way too much, but it's really true with her. You know, she was actually made an honorary member of the LSO, and I think there's only 8 people in its 100-year or so history where that has happened. So it's a big deal. I know that meant a lot to her. I mean, the amazing thing about Devorah was she was always there, whether she was actually working or not. When she retired, and I use the term loosely, in 2015, she still used to come to concerts, and she used to have this joy in music making and helping, being part of that. But she used to have the most extraordinary command of the English language. I mean, she would always come backstage and you'd see her and she'd always say, "Oh, my dear, that was wonderful, so wonderful." And I remember there was one particular concert where the repertoire was esoteric, shall we say, and it was a little bit impenetrable. And she came up and she just came up to me and held my hand and she said, "My dear, that was remarkable." And I still to this day don't know whether she hated it or she loved it. And she had this professional way of doing things. But I mean, I think one thing that sums her up really well, I think it must have been about 20 years ago, in one of the many money-saving things that orchestras have to do, it was discovered that providing flowers for the soloist every night was extortionately expensive. Even more so on our Sunday night concerts, because all the florists were shut. And so it was decided that we'd stop giving flowers because, you know, it was just too expensive. And Devorah found out about this, thought it was an absolutely awful idea, and she provided the flowers for the soloist from that moment on for the LSO, which is kind of her in a nutshell, really.
Yeah.
She'll be sadly missed. Yeah,
she'll be much missed in the industry. Yeah, and our love goes out to all of her real family as much as her sort of her bigger, wider family, which is so many people in the industry, and particularly the LSO, of course. Thank you, Gareth. Okay, well, let's get to the subject in hand then, and these moments in your life that have been key, have been important to you. Where are you starting?
Well, I'm starting right at the very beginning, and that was I wanted to play the trumpet. And I come from, to say I come from not a musical family is not really the case. I mean, my brother's a professional guitarist working in the West End, or rather not working in the West End at the moment. And my parents, my dad worked for trade unions. My mother was a teacher. But my name obviously is Welsh. My dad's from a small village in South Wales. So there was always a lot of singing going on. There was always music on at home. But it wasn't in our culture, as it were, to play an instrument. It wasn't something that they particularly thought of doing. And I was singing at school, my first school, and the music teacher said I had a good ear. Does he play an instrument? No. You should think about playing an instrument. So I said I wanted to play the trumpet because it's a real man's instrument, apparently. Anyway, my mum said it was too loud.
She was right. right?
Well, my son actually plays the trumpet. She was right.
Yeah.
It's really loud. But anyway, I was watching Blue Peter, and there was this Irish bloke, forget his name, because I'm that old. So really, one of my formative moments, which sometimes will make people turn their nose up. I mean, we've just joked about Jonas Kaufmann's Christmas album, but the sad thing is that will draw some people in, and maybe it will open the door. And actually, Annie's song, James Galway, did that for me. And he was on Blue Peter, and at the time, the flute was a girl's instrument. That's a girls play flutes, boys play trumpets. That was kind of it. And he was trying to get more people to play, particularly boys, he said, on Blue Peter. And they said, well, why should people play the flute? He said, well, it's not very difficult. And I thought, right, that's fair, I'm doing that. That was I actually met him a few years ago, and I tackled him about this, and I said, I've got a bone to pick with you, Jimmy. You said on Blue Peter in 1970 something that playing the flute was easy. And he said, and I didn't say it was easy to play well. Which is true.
Well, and by the way, it was lovely when we had James Galway as a guest on one of our special editions.
I know, I heard it. Yeah,
I was able to tell him exactly this, that he had inspired you, but it was in the context, of course, that thousands and thousands of people like you were inspired to take up the flute because of Jimmy Galway, who was so visible, was on all of those programs all of the time.
Well, it was amazing. I mean, there was a documentary on BBC 4 recently. I think it was called James Galway at the BBC. And it was funny because I was doing some teaching at his academy in the summer over in Vegas, which was great. I have to say, it was an amazing course. So supportive, all the students and Jeannie in particular with the young students. It really took me by surprise because I'm not a big flute geek. And I don't really like to do lots of flute convention stuff because it's full of, flute players. It was really amazing. But the producer was there just showing him the bits that they got. And I just said, have you got Val Doonican Christmas specials on? Because he seemed to be on Val Doonican every week when I was a kid. And I thought, how these little memories become this important. Yeah. And the producer just said, look at this, turned the laptop around, and there was just all this stuff, and it had this thing of him playing dueling banjos with him and playing the piccolo, and he was on it. I mean, I remember him being on the TV all the time when I was a kid, but it turns out he really was. He was there. It's funny because particularly when I was growing up, I was listening quietly to the James Galway albums, and other people were listening to all sorts of other things, and there was a real tendency to sort of look down your nose because he sort of, he virtually invented crossover, before it was a thing. But what's extraordinary about him is, the education stuff he does now is immense. There are thousands and thousands of kids now, young kids, if you ask them who their favorite flute player is, they still say James Galway. And when I grew up, you couldn't get in youth orchestras because it was full of flute players. In my youth orchestra, because of James Galway, I was second flute, and principal flute was Emily Bynon, who's now principal flute in the Concertgebouw. This is the influence he's had is huge. But, it's funny because on that documentary, it showed him playing, and there was the sparkly eyes, and there was the jokes, and there was all the Danny boys and all that stuff. But actually, I think when we're all long gone, the legacy that he will have is all of the music he's commissioned. Because there's a Rodrigo flute concerto because of James Galway, the Corigliano flute concerto. That I actually asked him, I said, do you know how many pieces you've commissioned? He said, I have no idea. No. And he genuinely doesn't know. There are so many. And I think, in the same way that Rostropovich, sort of the cellists of the 20th century have got this huge repertoire, largely because of him and being written for and commissioning stuff. And I think Galway will be the same. And I think that when all the showbiz stuff has disappeared, that stuff will be his real legacy. And, I think all flute players have got a huge amount to be grateful to him for.
Before we come back to Gareth having got that experience, that sort of big moment of inspiration, and then actually going on to be one of the top players in the world himself. Richard, what about you? You played the cello, but were you inspired by anyone in particular? Because I don't remember being inspired by a particular person as such with getting into music and starting to play percussion. It just sort of evolved. But was there anyone that you saw that inspired you with that?
Well, it wasn't really like that. I mean, my father listened to his recordings in the background to our home all the time. And as you'll know from previous weeks, Wagner was a big part of that, but also your real standard classics, your Beethoven's, the Planet Suite. He had a good collection of LPs which would come on with great ceremony. Usually on a Sunday afternoon, they'd be brought out of the sleeve, they'd be reverently polished, placed on the turntable, and it would sort of fill the home with this kind of warmth and sort of feeling of well-being and enjoyment. And but the truth of it was, I mean, my primary school on Wirral had a peripatetic scheme, which still does as far as I know. Peripatetic teachers came round, and one day in primary school, two ladies came into our classroom and said they'd like a word with us. And they said, well, we teach cello and the violin. If anyone here would like to learn to play the cello or the violin, let your class teacher know, and we'll talk to you next week. And I was just the kind of kid that put my hand up for everything. I was the uber swot. I'd been encouraged to be keen at school. If something was offered, you just did it. You didn't really ask any questions. You just put your name down and got on with it because that showed you're keen. The only question was violin or cello. I didn't really know what. I knew what the violin was. I thought I'd do some more research. We had, I think, a Ladybird book of musical instruments in the school library. And I had a quick look and rapidly established the cello was the big one, the violin was the small one. Obviously, as a boy, I could not be seen playing a violin. That was obviously the small one was the girl's instrument. This, to my 7-year-old mind, seemed pretty much unanswerable logic, and that was it. That's how I decided I will be playing the cello from now on.
Yeah.
And that's it. And then I sort of announced this when I got home, and his eyebrows went up. Really, the cello? Isn't that supposed to be the hardest of all instruments to play? And I was, oh, right. And my teacher said to me, he says, well, why have you chosen this? Is it because of the beautiful sound? You must love the sound of the cello. And I got no idea what a cello sounds like. You're about to show me. But I kept quiet, and here we are.
I'm very much looking forward to a review in the future, Richard, in The Spectator, where you say about the Brahms double concerto, where Anne-Sophie Mutter played the small one and Yo-Yo Ma played the big one. I'd love that. That was a degree of sophistication. That was how I got into classical music. That's the amount of thought I gave it, the amount of prior knowledge I had. I love it. I mean, what did happen was my parents, as I sort of did it, as I got better and better and worked my way up the grades, my parents were very, very encouraging all the way through, despite me having to lug this fragile, impractical crate of an instrument home every week from school. And we didn't have hard cases. I mean, I couldn't have handled a hard case at that size. So it was a soft case, which means that anyone who kicked a football in your direction or hurled a school bag or aimed a kick, that was it for the cello. And we got through quite a few instruments from the school stock, so generally being smashed. It was the absolute terror when a string snapped. What are we supposed to do? What have you done wrong? This is going to be expensive. It was a real learning curve. But my parents did take me to see Paul Tortelier playing the Liverpool Philharmonic. He was the first real cellist I ever saw. And I mean, he was a huge personality. We've talked before about him. Incredible sort of presence, charisma. He's one of the great sort of eccentrics of classical music, and also one of the great sort of characters of the cello. Very impressive figure on stage, and I remember he made a deep impression. Before I come to you, Charlotte, I went through all my archive stuff. I mentioned last week that I kept everything. I've got all my programs from everything I've ever done from the age of about 5 onwards. And I found a little thing here. Richard was talking about how he was a bit of a square and did everything he was told at school. I was the exact opposite of that. But we had the most wonderful music in my primary school in Oldcombe in Kent, and we did every Friday afternoon. It was called a ceilidh. Everyone could just perform something, anything on whatever instrument they had, or they sing, or whatever it was they wanted to do. And they did a tape of us one year. I think it was in 1980. It was, so I was about 8 or 9, and 30 seconds of me. It says Tommy's Boogie. And I'm very pleased with this bit. It says it's a stomping piece of boogie-woogie New Orleans-style piano from Tommy, who is very inventive with piano and auto harp. I'll take that. I think that's great. But what's nice is it says, perhaps one day Tommy will play like Fats Domino. It never happened, But it's some great memories. There's lots of lovely early memories of playing music at primary school. Charlotte, what about you with instruments and any kind of inspiration as far as that was concerned?
Instruments and inspiration. Well, there's a sense to which there's a very similar story to Richard, in that it was when I was about 7 or 8, peripatetic teacher came into my state school and said, violin teaching is going to start. Would anybody like to play the violin? And like Richard, I was the geek swot in the class and I put my hand up for everything. I wasn't given the chance for cello, so it was the violin. And so I found myself with I was the school titch. I was tiny. I was called titch for the first few years of my school education up until sort of secondary school. And I had this 3/4 size violin because it was all the county youth service had. So there was me with this absolutely whopper instrument in my hand. It was about twice the size of me, and group lessons. And somehow I made it through to proper lessons. They found I had talent. But in terms of being inspired, it wasn't actually the violin where I first got really, really inspired by music, I have to say. I mean, I was also a recorder player. And a really, really key moment for me about the same time was, again, the county music service organised a recorded concert. And it was a recorder orchestra. And I can remember driving with the teacher who did recorder club at my school to this big school and meeting up with, I don't know, maybe 80 other young recorder players with recorders of all different sizes. And I will never forget the noise when we all started playing, the Disney medley. And it probably, to you, it might sound like a little slice of musical hell. But for me, this was, oh my gosh, chimmery played by recorders of every single size. And the sound, this woody kind of like this chorus of plastic wood pigeons giving us Disney. It was absolutely mental. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And it was a really, really key moment. And then the other one, it was actually my first... It was when I was in year 6, and the senior school of I'd now moved to a girls' school, and one of our school governors was Cliff Richard. And so we found ourselves in this bizarre situation where when I was 10, I was in a concert with Cliff Richard. He came in, he did a concert in Bristol's Colston Hall, now the Beacon, and we did this whole lots of classical stuff. We sung all sorts, and then the chamber choir were Cliff's backing singers for the evening. And I was yet to get Tommy's face. Listeners should know that
he's fantastic. Yeah, I love it. This entire contribution has taken a turn I really wasn't expecting.
Well, yeah, on a bad musical note, it meant that I got a real thing for Cliff Richard afterwards. And so while all my friends were bopping around to New Kids on the Block and the Walkmans, I had Cliff Richard on mine. And I'm afraid it took me about 5 years to get over this. But this concert was, it was absolutely incredible. I was this 10-year-old. I was about to go into a senior school where it wasn't a music school, but it was as close as a normal school would ever get to a music school, in that there were practice periods throughout the day. We sang everywhere. We had incredible level of musicianship. And suddenly I was this junior school person singing things like Yesterday and Joseph and the Amazing kind of Dreamcoat, but watching the senior school orchestra play Plink Plank Plunk and a fifth of Beethoven, and watching the middle school choir sing Elgar's Fly Singing Bird Fly, and then watching Cliff Richard sing Beatles numbers and Cliff songs with the school chamber choir. Awesome. And it was the first time I had looked up to kids older than me and saw incredible musicianship and saw choirs and orchestras that I wanted to be in. And because I didn't grow up in a musical family, or even a family that listens to classical music, all my music when I was young was either stuff I was playing or stuff I was watching other people play in concerts. And just to suddenly have role models that were my peers was incredibly powerful. And although so when I got into the senior school and suddenly started playing in this orchestra and singing in those choirs, I mean, it was a huge moment for me. And devastatingly, the school closed about 2 years later, and I lost all of that. But it stayed with me, just making music with other people and seeing older kids make wonderful music and wanting to be as good as them.
Fabulous. Gareth, having got a flute to your mouth and discovered that it wasn't necessarily as easy as James Galway had made out, Did you know though? Did you know then? I mean, so many people talk about how the instrument just fitted them, and they knew. Was it like that?
Not really. I mean, it's funny because when you learn to play the flute, the first lesson you get the head joint and you blow across the hole, and of course, you've usually done that over a bottle of Coke or other soft drink in a pub and annoyed your parents. It's not very difficult. I mean, anybody can do it, but the advantage is that in your first flute lesson, you make a sound that sounds a bit like a flute, and then it's basically about refining it. Whereas as both Richard and Charlotte will tell you, playing a stringed instrument is quite painful for quite some time, particularly for your parents.
Oh yes.
The violin doesn't really sound like a violin for a very long time, which I think is why you have to start so young, because you're not really aware of how hideous it sounds. But I never, it's funny because I love playing the flute, and I think I love playing the flute because I've reached the stage, nearly in my life where I can make it do the things I want it to do, so I can control it. Because there's a piano here, it's not real, it's just cardboard, because I'm hopeless at it. I mean, I can play the piano but not in public, and I tried to teach myself the guitar a while ago, because my brother, he's the cool one because he plays guitar, and I just couldn't do it, and I found it very frustrating. But I think that the flute is partly when you play in the orchestra, which is mainly what I do, you're often on the top playing the tune, soaring above things. It's a bit like being a singer at times, not all the time. Sometimes you need to stop playing like that and go into the texture. But there's an element of it being very much like singing, which I mean, I would love to be a singer. I wouldn't be. Let's just make that clear. But I always tell my students, you should listen to singers if you want to hear how to phrase and stuff, because that's the most natural form of music making. So it's always been a battle for me to not let the flute get in the way. So I mean, it was quite a while, and I must admit, I never had one of those moments where I thought, oh, I'm going to do this for a job. I didn't really. It just sort of happened. I mean, I still feel like a bit of an imposter, and somebody is going to find out one day that actually I should be doing something else.
I think that's a very, very common feeling of a lot of people at the top of their profession in a funny way, isn't it?
It gets worse the older you get as well, because there's just more and more young people coming up, seemingly doing all the things you struggled with for years so easily, and there's some really great players around. You can't hide now because everything is on the internet.
How true that is, and we'll come to that. But I mean, you've been doing this for quite a while now, Gareth. What are the other sort of moments that are key to you in this profession?
I mean, there are so many. I mean, I've been so fortunate. I've been in the LSO for 20 years now as principal flute, and I've had so many amazing experiences, and over this lockdown period, it's really made me focus on things, because as we discussed before this started, musicians do like to moan about things. And this has been a good time to go, actually, it wasn't so bad, was it? I mean, I don't think I'm a particular moaner. I have my moments, but I was the chairman of the orchestra for a while, and I heard enough moaning for a lifetime, quite frankly, during that time. But I had when you do auditions, you have to play excerpts, and one of the big excerpts for a flute player is the first 4 bars of the Prélude de l'après-midi de Faune by Debussy. And it's one of those things. It's weird because, of course, it's the first 4 bars of the piece, and flute players obsess over it and sort of completely forget that the rest of the woodwind section also worry about that piece. But of course, there's the first 4 bars. Do you do it in one breath? Do you not do it in one breath? And the trouble is, whatever you practice, when you sit on the stage for the first time, and then there's 2,000 people sitting there, and it goes quiet, and the conductor hopefully doesn't conduct it, and if they do, I just ignore it. But normally they just look at you and say, okay, when you're ready. And then it's really weird, because in a rehearsal it's quiet, but when there are 2,000 people watching and then it goes quiet, it's a totally different kind of quiet, and it's absolutely terrifying. And just at the time when you need to be most in control of your breathing, your heart starts going nuts. And I remember that bizarrely, the very first time I played that piece was in what is now called the Lighthouse Pool Art Centre, because I was in the London Symphony Orchestra for 5 years. And I played that. I got that job when I was 22. And I didn't know, every week it was like a voyage of discovery of another piece. Everybody else would be like, oh no, not Brahms 1 again. I'd be like, hey, Brahms 1. Never played that. This is really good, isn't it? We did Lapramidi, and it was fine. And the next time I played it was in the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. And then the time after that was in Carnegie Hall in New York. And I was so young, I was just like, oh, this is a really nice hall. I mean, I didn't fully realize just how big this was. I played it many, many times now. And on the tour with the Bournemouth, we played it about 25 times. And you'd think after that many times it would become, it's terrifying. It just, there's always something. It might be the air conditioning is running at a constant C instead of your C sharp or something like that, or people just make too much noise. But I can remember because the late great Yakov Kreutzberg was our principal conductor. He was my first principal conductor, and we joined on the same day. And we did that piece a lot. And he used to come across, and he was very keen and new in Bournemouth, and so was I. And he used to come across and say, this piece, I think maybe on the first note, you should do no vibrato. And then the second note, still no vibrato, but then gradually bring in a little bit of vibrato. But when you get to the long note again, no vibrato. I'll be like, oh, okay, writing all this stuff in. And we got to Amsterdam. And of course, I sat there and looked around and thought, well, this is quite big. And, the acoustics, very nice. And I played, and I could feel my heart going. And I started the first note, and it started, but there was a gentle bit of vibrato, and we had a reception afterwards, and Yakov came up to me and he said, oh, Gareth, it was great, but I could hear vibrato. I said, no, I didn't do any vibrato. He said, you did? I said, no, that was my heartbeat. And it was this, it never gets any easier. And we did it with Gergiev in the LSO. We recorded it, and it was the slowest I've ever done. I mean, I did it in one breath, and every time I hear it, it was on the radio every now and again, and every time I hear it, I'm still thinking, yeah, I won't make it this time. It's that hideous. There's a new version of it on LSO Live that has just come out with Francois Xavier Roth, who's great, and he's a flute player himself. And I think it's the whole piece, I think, is about 4 minutes quicker than the Gergiev version. So there's a huge thing, but funnily enough, it doesn't get any easier. Although I do actually have a running watch, which shows me my heart rate.
Oh, yes.
And so I set it to record because I thought I'd love to know what it is. And interestingly, when I finished, my heart rate went up when I had to walk up the steps onto the stage at the Barbican, and then I sat down, and it stayed relatively. I think it was about 80 beats per minute, and it stayed the same all the way through that. And now, if you'd have asked me what my heart rate was, I would have sworn blind it was racing, but it didn't. I don't know. Maybe that's the psychology of being a musician. But it's a funny piece, and people always ask about it, including my favorite. A friend of mine reminded me of this. When I told her I was doing this with you, but I did an interview when the LSO was doing the last Star Wars films a few years ago. I did an interview for an American magazine, a wind magazine, Bands or Winds or something like that. And they were asking me, of course, mainly about Star Wars, because my son, who is called Luke, I am his father, was 7 at the time. And they were saying it must be so cool for your dad to be in the LSO. And I was like, I'm not in Star Wars. And I said, well, I'm not actually in Star. I played on the soundtrack. And they asked me, the interview was all on the phone. And they said, what's your favorite pieces to play? So I listed them all. I said, and of course there's Lapramidi, which is what everybody calls it, Lapramidi. And when it came out in print, it said Gareth's favorite piece to play in the orchestra is by Debussy, and it's called La Pyramide, which sounds like some kind of Egyptian tone poem or something. I imagine all these flute players going, I don't know that one. I must look that one up.
I thought you were going to say that because you did the interview on the phone that it was called L'après-midi, an afternoon on the phone, which is
on the phone. Yes,
people do.
That has been done too.
Yes. But what I've often found interesting about you, Gareth, is that you have a very sunny disposition on stage, even if you are, very nervous before doing a solo like that. Yeah. You don't give that impression. No. And I think that it's easy to think that those of us that did music, even relatively seriously, but still didn't go into the profession as instrumentalists, we can retain the joy of it, if you like. The everything about playing is about enjoyment of it, because that's why we do it. With the professional musicians, of course, it is slightly different to that, isn't it? Because it is a day job in the end. You do have to turn up on time, do the job, go home again, and you do it every day. So it becomes much more like a job, even if it's a vocation. And so it must be quite difficult. And sometimes I suppose it might be that people are surprised to find that some of your big moments in your life are actually within your profession, given that you do it every day and it's it's something you do. How do you manage to retain an excitement in the things that you do when it is a day job like that?
Well, I think actually the things that get you down about my job are probably the same as gets everybody down about their job. It's Southwest trains. I hate them.
Yes.
And just and just never having enough time to do anything. I mean, I think one of the advantages of certainly being a British musician, if you can call it an advantage, is the lack of preparation time. Because whenever I do those flute events in Europe, other flute players look at my schedule and just laugh and go, well, you're mad. You work 3 times harder than we do and you get paid at least half as much. And there's never enough time. And certainly people come on trial from other orchestras and they're just taken aback. I mean, the advantage is that the schedule is constantly changing and it's very varied. I mean, one week we'll work with Bernard Haitink in the morning. I mean, I remember specifically doing one week, we were doing Mahler 4 with Bernard Haitink, and we had, it was about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe. And so we just had one rehearsal each day. So we had a rehearsal in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we were doing a film soundtrack with Alexander Desplat. And then the day, so it's this whole dual schedule, which instantly makes it interesting. And then later on that week, we were recording the soundtrack for Candy Crush Soda Saga, Yeah. And then you'll be doing some education work, and then you'll be doing something else. And actually, it's difficult. It's very easy to get cynical about these things, but I am really fortunate that I'm surrounded by some really inspiring musicians. I mean, last night we did a concert with Paavo Järvi, which we don't work with him very much, and it was just so much fun. We did Beethoven 8. I mean, I don't really like Beethoven 8. The last movement always gets slower and slower and slower, and I mean, the only good thing is it's short. But last night I just wanted to play it again. It was great. It was really good. But I say in the first half, there was no interval, but one of the pieces with the Haydn Sinfonia Concertante, with which we had our leader, principal oboe, principal bassoon, and principal cellist playing. And I think you could call it's a charming piece. It's, it's not deep or meaningful, but it's very nice. And they really polished that work, shall we say. It was amazing. And I was sitting listening to Dan playing the bassoon, and he's got such a beautiful sound, and normally he sat right behind me, and seeing him out the front and hearing him there, it sounds even better, because you don't hear all the bits and the grunts and groans that you get in the section. And when you've got people like that you play with, and then we get great conductors, great singers and stuff, it's not difficult to remain excited about what you do. I mean, I still feel really excited about playing in the orchestra, particularly at the moment, because it's been easy to take it for granted, and as I said, my brother's not working at the moment, my son's not working at the moment, he's a musician as well, and I am a bit, and I will be very, very grateful until I finished for that.
I wonder whether you mentioned it slightly earlier, Charlotte, we're all old enough to have benefited enormously from county music services that are really a shadow of their former selves nowadays, sadly. And in fact, some counties don't even have one anymore because they were cut by their county. Charlotte, you mentioned about your county music service. I mean, I found, looking back, that actually a lot of the really key moments in my life were as a result of being part of this incredible county music service that we had in Kent, which was the largest one in Europe at that point. Huge number of students of all ages learning instruments all across the county in Kent, and I benefited from that in so many different ways. I shall come to that. Was that the case with you, Charlotte?
Yeah, I spent most of my teens and tweens I spent in county youth orchestras. I went up through all of the county youth orchestras from the beginner up to the senior one. I was also involved. There was a chamber section as well, and so every Friday night I was playing chamber music, quartets, quintets, whatever. It was everywhere. It was my entire life. And even when I left the state system and went into a private school, I still carried on with all of the county youth orchestra stuff. And yeah, it was where I experienced orchestral repertoire for the first time, where I experienced a huge amount of chamber repertoire. And I made friends. Some of my friends I've kept. It was really, really profound. And I think also just talk about inspiration for me, when I wasn't hearing incredible soloists, professional orchestras all the time, my inspiration was always getting into the next orchestra up, seeing the wonderful players around me and wanting to be as good as them. So it was really profound. But actually, I'm quite lucky. I'm in North London, and actually the Haringey Music Service is still going really great guns. They do a wonderful job. They've got wonderful wind bands, orchestras still. They're trying to get my daughter, who's just started oboe, into one of the junior orchestras at the moment. I'm going to be pushing her to do that, because there is, in certain pockets of the country, it is still there. And in fact, both of my kids started their music lessons through peripatetic teachers at school, exactly in the same way, which I'm incredibly grateful for.
Yeah, no, and I wouldn't want to paint the wrong picture. Of course, that's absolutely true. I think it is a general sort of national experience, though, that clearly the resources are not quite as there as they used to be. But Richard, just briefly from you as well, also county music. You're in the Wirral. You're in the Merseyside Youth Orchestra. Some relatively successable musicians have come out of that system. Well, that Gareth knows very well as well.
Yes. There'd been this weird sort of civil war amongst the youth ensembles on the Wirral shortly before I got into them, and basically all the really good ones had been hived off into the private sector because the parents had fallen out with the local authority about how it should be run. So there's kind of a state-run system of county ensembles which played things like, medley from Cats and so on, and then there's this sort of privately run ensembles that have been recently hived off by a bunch of rebel parents who ran something called the Wirral Youth Orchestra, and they were conducted by a former violinist from the local Phil, and did things like Dvorak symphonies and so on. There's no question which of those I was wanting to be involved with, which is a bit tricky because all my lessons came through the state sector and the peripatetics, and I was kind of told, you shouldn't really be playing in that orchestra, you should be playing in this orchestra. I thought, well, I don't want to play the theme from Dallas, I want to play Dvorak. Which possibly uncool of me, I don't know. But yeah, then Merseyside Youth Orchestra across the river in Liverpool, that was run by the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, as it still is, now calls itself the Liverpool Philharmonic Youth Orchestra, to make that connection explicit. But it's, they played in the Philharmonic Hall, you went on tour with the Philharmonic Road Crew and the Philharmonic Van, you'd get to conduct, you get Leopold Pezek, Charles Groves would occasionally drop by and conduct for you if you were very lucky on special occasions. It was fantastic. We shared the band rooms, we went into the percussion cupboards, we had the same dressing rooms as the Liverpool Phil players. It was like being in the professional orchestra. And as a teenager, God, I mean, wow, that's like having the best train set on earth. I mean, you going in through the artist's entrance after school in your school uniform, going out onto the platform at the Philharmonic Hall, sitting down and playing Vaughan Williams 2 or Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto or whatever Kenneth Hesketh had written that week, because he was a graduate of the Merseyside Youth Orchestra. And of course, we all knew Simon Rattle started in that orchestra, Peter Donahoe had started in that orchestra, Jackie Hartley, who went on to be leader of the co-leader of the CBSO, had been in that orchestra. The CBSO's current principal second clarinet, Joe Patton, was contemporary of mine in the Merseyside Youth Orchestra. Ed Smith, who went on to be manager of the CBSO and who hired Rattle there, had managed RLPO. Kenneth Hesketh wrote us pieces. It was it was a hell of a time. Yeah, I mean, for a teenager, it's like getting illicit booze. You know, it was, you know,
Well,
it's a strong stuff.
We had plenty of that in my youth orchestra. Anyway.
Well, there was that as well, of course. Yes, there's a few stories about that too. But yeah, it was you know, what if you're involved with that organisation, then you can totally see why these figures emerged from it. It was the kind of environment where, I mean, 15, 20 years before me, Simon Rattle had shown up as a 12-year-old, asked if he could conduct Mahler 2, and they said, well, why not? If you can get the players together, we will back you on that, and they kind of did.
It is interesting, isn't it, how so much is down to geography. I mean, I listened to you. I had none of this growing up in deepest, darkest Somerset. We had just members of the youth service who were conducting the orchestras. I had no idea which musicians might have been in the orchestras before me. I suspect there weren't anyone very famous. I mean, it was really good, passionate local music, but there was none of the rest. There was no contact with professional musicians, professional conductors, composers. We were very much, I spent my tweens and teens in a complete Somerset bubble. I wonder whether it's a bit better now. Places like the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra are doing their best to cover that sort of area with their education work. But it wasn't the case in the 80s and 90s when I was there.
Well, we being in Kent, of course, right next door to London, we had the best of them. It was amazing, a fantastic group of professional musicians from London that would come down and tutor us on our courses. I wanted to say that one of the great things about the Kent Youth Orchestra is we hardly ever did anything that was written before 1900. It was just an incredible education in 20th century repertoire that we would get right inside because we'd be playing it. I always feel very lucky about that. And we did a lot of commissions. But one of the things I was going to say about one of my moments is that they used to commission me. I was only a teenager composer, but what is really amazing, I still think, is that they commissioned me like a real composer. It was never, I am a student, I have lots to learn. And I mean, there's no question that I did, but they used to write to me formally to commission me to write a piece of music in a way that they would, I think, with any composer. And I mean, I was a kind of cocky teenager and didn't really know any better, but I look at those letters now and I think, wow, how lucky was I that these people gave me these incredible opportunities and treated me like a regular person rather than sort of in a sort of patronizing way. And I think that it means that they valued me and they valued what I did, but also, of course, knew very, very well what they were doing. They were giving me the opportunities that they knew would be incredibly valuable for the rest of my life. And these are the really key people who shine out when you look back over your life. I've got a program here of a piece that I wrote in 1989. I think it was 17 when I wrote it, and it's a big orchestral piece that was commissioned for the 100th anniversary of the Kent County Council. You know, they asked me to do the piece for that, and I still can't quite get over that. It was one of the pieces that helped get me into the Royal Academy of Music that year. Wow, what an amazing opportunity. So I'll never forget that. And it sort of set me on my path, really, on one of my paths anyway. Yeah, amazing opportunities from County Music Services, and long may they continue. Gareth, another memory from you?
Well, Richard mentioned Mahler 2 just then, and that was one of those moments. I mean, I heard, like many people, the LSO when I listened to Star Wars, but I honestly didn't know who it was. I just thought, wow, this is cool. I was more interested in the lightsabers at that age. Yeah. But and I remember on my 21st birthday, I got tickets to hear the LSO with Schulte conducting, and they were doing the Hafner Symphony and Mahler 5. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by the sound of this orchestra. I mean, because they were, I was at the Guildhall, so I literally was just next door, got tickets at the last minute. It was like, oh yeah, I think it was the day before my 21st birthday, actually. No, I can't have been 20. No, I must have been about 19. I know. Anyway, it was last century. And I was blown away by the sound of the orchestra. And I'd been to lots of concerts, but there was something about the sound of the LSO that was really intoxicating. And I said to my flatmate at the time, I said, I really want to play in this orchestra. And it kind of wasn't about playing in an orchestra. It was about playing in this orchestra. And I didn't actually have to wait that long, because I did, when I was at the Guildhall, there were the separate graduate course for people who wanted to be teachers, which was the one I did, and the performance course where you got to practice for 4 years. And I finished my degree, and then I did a postgrad, but it was kind of fairly inconsequential. And I did what all students did, and I wrote my CV, which was very, very short indeed, to all the principal flutes in London, and I didn't hear back from anybody, and thought, oh well, never mind. Got a job in a sports shop, and I thought, well, here we go. I'll just keep trying, and I had this phone call, and I was at home, and I had my diary by the phone. And which you had to wear sunglasses to look at. It was so white and empty. And and the phone rang, and it was the orchestral manager of the LSO, and he said, "Are you free today?" And I remember, look, hang on, I'll just check my diary, knowing full well, I literally had nothing in it. And I said, yes, I am. He said, can you be at CTS Studios at 10 o'clock for a film session? I was like, yeah. And then he said, do you know where CTS Studios is? I said, no. And so he said, well, it's a big grey building next to Wembley Stadium. Now, for anybody that hasn't been anywhere around there, this is the old Wembley Stadium. Yeah. Every single building around it was a big grey building, you know. And I didn't know where it was. And anyway, it turned out that I got asked because who was it? Somebody was ill. I think somebody had gone into labour and they needed somebody that day. They tried all their normal people who weren't free. And my CV was on a pile, and Paul Davies, the principal flute, used to teach me, and he said, well, let's give him a go. So I turned up at Wembley, and it was a touch and go whether I got there. It was 5 to 10. And I turned up at the Wembley Park tube station, saw the staging and thought, I have no idea. And then I saw Paul Silverthorne, the principal viola of the LSO, who had a ponytail. So I recognised him from behind. And he was walking really slowly, obviously aiming to get there like 30 seconds before. I was sort of willing him forward. So that was the first time I got to play. And I obviously did okay, because then a couple of days later, they phoned up and said, are you free today? It's like the last minute. I said, yeah, sure. And it turned out that Martin Parry, who was the second flute, had they'd done a concert of Mahler 2 on the Monday night or something like that. And on his way home, he'd fallen over and broken his ankle. He was in hospital. And so it was the repeat concert the next day. Again, they tried everybody else. Nobody was there. Well, he did all right in the session. Let's get him in. And this is how his career starts, you know. Just I didn't have anything to do with Martin's ankle breaking, by the way. But it was Mahler 2. And I turned up, and of course, because they'd done the concert the night before, there was a seating call of 30 minutes at 6 o'clock till 6:30, 7:30 concert. And to my shame, I didn't know the first flute part to Mahler 2, which is the normal thing. You know, they teach you at college how to play all the fancy solos, which of course it's years before you get asked to do them. And I didn't know the second flute part. I didn't know the first flute part. I hadn't ever listened to Mahler 2. I didn't know it at all, which is appalling to actually admit that. So I turned up for this half an hour seating call. And as you know, Mahler 2 is significantly longer than a 30-minute seating call. And Paul was playing first flute, and he said to me, do you know this? I said, no. He said, don't worry, there's a couple of bits. We'll do those. Just stick with me. You'll be fine. And he had this air of calm about him. And I thought, okay, he'll be fine. You know, I'll be all right. And it's not a huge flute part. There's a quite a bit for the first flute, and there's a couple of duetty bits, but it's just, you know, when you play a Mahler symphony, how it looks and how it sounds are two different things. And there's so many traditions which some conductors do and some ignore, and things which nobody's bothered to write in the music because that's how it goes. And it I remember it was Michael Tilson Thomas was conducting, and he came across and said, he asked about Martin, and he said, and who's this? And Paul said, this is Gareth Davies, one of my ex-students. He's just coming in. And I wanted to say, oh, I'm so excited, it's my first time. And Michael said, and do you know Mahler 2, Gareth? And Paul said, yes, he does. I just went, nodded. Right. And anyway, so we got to the concert, and it was going really well. As you can imagine, I mean, this was the first time I'd played in a professional orchestra. And I hadn't played very much at college in an orchestra. So this really was in at the deep end, live in a concert. And the sound was, I mean, weeks earlier, I'd been sat thinking, I want to play in this orchestra. And there I am, sat in the orchestra with
Amazing.
all my heroes surrounding me. And I just wanted to keep stopping the orchestra and go, this is great. I love this. I wanted to turn around and go, this is great. And as I said, I didn't know Mahler 2, and I was really excited. I mean, you know, it's quite it's a life-affirming work, but it's got its moments, and it's Mahler, so there's always that edge to it. And there were probably people watching going, why is that kid grinning like a Cheshire cat all the way through? You know, I think I got my mum and dad to come and watch it, and certainly my flatmate. And I was like, you never guess what I'm doing. So it gets towards the end, and as I said, I didn't know the piece, and I kind of hadn't really thought about it, but there was a whole load of people sat behind me that I didn't know what they were really there. I assumed they were the audience or something like this. And then, of course, it gets very quiet, and then the choir starts singing, and of course, they come in really quietly. And I was like, oh, this is good. And I mean, discovering a work for the first time, actually playing it, it's just, you should never do this. If you're a student listening, do not do this. But I just fun. And of course, and then the choir got to the bit where they go, Bereite, and I just wanted to jump up and down and punch the air. And it was and still is the most overwhelming end to a symphony for me, and it's partly because of that, because I always remember that and have a smile on my face.
Wonderful.
And I didn't spread it all over the ceiling. I didn't go wrong in any way that anybody would notice, and I also I had a valuable lesson about the state of mind of musicians, because I remember there was the great Roy Carter was on principal oboe, and man, I learned so much from that man, sitting next to him for a few years in the LSO, about phrasing. It was just extraordinary what he could do. And in that, the movement with the mezzo there, it was just, it was breathtaking. This phrase just started and it went on forever. It was incredible. I can still remember it now. And at the end of the concert, he leant forward, and of course Paul had said, he's Gareth, he's never played it before. and he leant forward and he said, did you enjoy that, Gareth? I said, yeah, it was brilliant. He said, yeah, it was great, wasn't it? And I said, yeah, it was really great. And then he turned to Paul and said, that was shit, wasn't it? I just thought it was really funny, because I just thought it cannot get any better than this. This was just amazing. But it's still, Mahler has always retained that sort of real something for me. It was my first experience. I've had many deep and meaningful experiences playing Mahler symphonies, and it was just wonderful, really wonderful.
Amazing. You talking about ringing up all the principal flutes and not getting answers, it reminded me of another moment that I wanted to bring in for me, which was when I was 19, our youth orchestra appeared on a BBC Kids program playing the Planets Suite, Holst. And it was presented by Jonathan Cohen, who, for anyone of our age, is a legend of children's television, because he's the pianist of Play School, Play Away, my favorite, all these things. And he was the presenter. And in a break in the recording, and we were at BBC Television Centre, which in itself was an awesome thing to be at. I went up to him and was talking to him, because I'd left the academy by then, and I was talking to him about, I'm really interested in getting into a bit more media music, maybe some arranging, something like that. Had he got any tips? And he was really nice, and he talked to me a little bit about the stuff that he'd done and his route through and everything. That was nice. And he said, why don't you give me your phone number? So I gave him my phone number, and he gave me his phone number on the back of the script, which I've still got for the TV show. And I thought, well, it's very nice, but I won't expect anything. And then 2 weeks later, I was at home at my parents', and the phone went, and it was the producer, David Kernan, who used to be one of the producers on That Was the Week That Was, big variety producer. He said, hello, I'm producing a all-star gala at the London Palladium, and Jonathan Cohen has highly recommended you. Would you like to do some arrangements for Petula Clark and Susie Quattro? And I sort of went, and I felt like doing like you said, let me just check my diary. Yes, and it was just, and to me, it was an amazing experience to work with. People like Petula Clark and Susie Quattro I was a huge fan of, because she used to play the bass very low down. It was fantastic, those days in the leather and all the rest of it. And I did Doa Deer from Sound of Music with Petula Clark and the cast from The Bill. and Susie Quattro did Moonshine Lullaby from Annie Get Your Gun. An incredible experience for a 19-year-old who'd never done anything like this before in his life. Really frightening, but great fun. But what an amazingly generous thing to do from Jonathan Cohen. He didn't know me from Adam. And yet he just obviously thought, let's just give this kid a chance. Amazing. You don't get that very often in this profession, I don't think. And I've never forgotten it. And how lovely it is that in recent years, thanks to Facebook, I've been able to reconnect with Jonathan and to thank him personally, because I hadn't seen him for, however many decades it was since then. So that was an amazing experience. Just so the generosity of one person can change everything, really. And it did. It just threw me into that level of things. And I never wanted to leave it, because I just found it so intoxicating, just being around all these incredible people. It's amazing musicians, amazing performance. So brilliant. Now, listen, we're running out of time a little bit, but Charlotte and Richard, let's do some quick key moments from you guys that we shouldn't that you'd want to let us know about. Richard, first.
Those are we talked about peripatetic teachers and how influential they were. We had a I wouldn't say we were badly served for music at my school. It was an all-boys school, a state school, but the emphasis is very much on sport rather than music. And it wasn't the done thing. But we would occasionally get people coming around to encourage us. So we had a percussion workshop with I now know, at least I think I now know, it was Kiwi Graham Johns, the New Zealand principal percussionist, the Liverpool Phil. It was this percussion workshop, and I remember being corralled into this as someone who's deemed to be musical and thinking, hang on, we're just hitting things. This isn't music. What? Stop patronizing me. Terribly awful. I now know what they were doing and what a high level they're doing it at. But there's very much this message where, if you can hit things, you can make music. I thought, no, that's not making music. Making music is sitting down with a score and dots on a page, and you play it on a proper instrument like a cello. But we did have this peripatetic violin teacher who just, I don't know, we were just talking about the generosity of musicians. There was, generally where musicians are working with young people, I've always tended to find this enormous willingness to sort of try and help, to try and encourage, try and draw people out, try and give them that lift up. That impulse to do that seems very widespread. It is one of the best things I think about the profession. And he just knew that he knew enough about the string players in our school to know who could play what, and he was the first person who just had this idea of getting three of us together, sitting down with us and taking us through a movement of a Haydn string quartet, the Lark Quartet. He played the first part, and as a pro obviously he sounded fantastic, and the lower parts totally within the range he knew of us as grade 7, grade 6-ish sort of standard players. I just remember sitting down there with this sort of adult leading us, and sort of two of my schoolmates in the lunch hour, and playing the first few bars and how it sounded, how it came together. And oh my God, this is music. This is real music, not percussion stuff, not workshops, not everyone improvising, not, aleatory or graphic scores or any of these fantastic devices meant to show us that we were all equally gifted. But this was something which I had acquired through my skill, and my colleagues had acquired through their skill, and we were putting it together. This sounds terrible. Maybe this is how an elitist is born. I don't know. But at that, I just remember thinking, this sounds so great. This is what I want to be involved with. This is terrific. And just that one lunchtime we played through the Lark Quartet was a moment that has never ever left me, and it set me off on so many different tracks really in my career. Things I still love doing.
Charlotte, is there something that inspired you that actually sent you on the path that you're on now, which is writing about music?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it was my first gig as classical music editor of my university paper, was to cover Simon Rattle bringing the CBSO with Mahler 5 to Cambridge Corn Exchange. And I don't know why they did this. I don't think I was I can't even remember what I was writing about in the newspaper, but for some reason they invited me to the rehearsal. I wasn't interviewing anybody. There was no reason why they should have done this, but it meant that coming from Somerset very early in my university days, I think this was the first professional orchestra I had ever heard play live. And there I was in an empty Cambridge Corn Exchange on the front row, hearing them rehearse the final movement of Mahler 5. And I can remember I was blown away. I can still remember the vibrations of the floorboards under my feet, Simon right there in front of me. And I can remember thinking, okay, if this is what it is to be a music journalist, I have to do this job. And to this day, it's rehearsals that I love more than anything else. But it's funny, what Gareth was saying about generosity and also about not knowing very much at the start of your career resonates so strongly with me. Because I was constantly amazed when my first real job, when I got through working in a call centre after university, which was awful. But my first job that I wanted to do was right at the bottom of the food chain on Radio 3 as a broadcast assistant for In Tune and Morning on 3. And I always say that at university, you learn an awful lot about not very much. And I think I learned far more in 3 months, those first 3 months at Radio 3 than I had done in 3 years studying music at Cambridge. Just the breadth of repertoire, just stuff that hadn't even crossed my orbit. And one of those was the Haydn Cello Concerto in C major, number 1. And generosity, this was actually the In Tune office. CDs would come in by the box load each day, and there were lots of duplicates. And somebody just passed my desk and chucked the Rostropovich EMI recording, 1975, the one that he led rather than being conducted by Britain. And I said, oh, you can have this. And so I put it in the CD player straight away. And this was not only my first hearing of Haydn C major, it was my first hearing of Rostropovich. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, first you had this radiant music, and then, oh my gosh, that tone. And I don't think I got onto the second movement for a long time because I kept on rewinding the first movement. But then the real bit of generosity from those very, very first few months it was an In Tune when I was the broadcast assistant of the day, and we were all down in the studio, and the producer that day was Brian Jackson. And Brian had really taken me under his wing right from the beginning. And it was a really discombobulating time. I suddenly learned that I knew not very much at all. I had to learn how to do this professional job. And I remember those first few weeks and months as just noise and trying to keep up. And then there was this program, and at the end of each hour, you have your clutch of CDs and you do the calculations. And based on how many minutes you have left at the top, you look through your pile of CDs, you find the piece of music that fits for your filler, and you stick it on. Now, Brian had brought down Christine Schaeffer singing Richard Strauss's Morgan. And I think he really hoped that it was going to fit. And it did. And he said to me, do you know it? And I think he knew I was going to say no, to be honest. And he loved this piece. And he said, okay, everything's sorted for the next hour. We don't have to do anything other than listen to this music. And I can remember it was him, Giles, the studio manager, and me. And they cranked up the volume loud. Nobody talked. And the three of us just sat and listened to Christine Schaeffer singing this incredible oral depiction of sunset and happiness and the promise of more love the following day. And I say it was my first serene moment, my first moment of realizing that I was surrounded by people who just loved music and wanted other people to love music in that whole crazy time. And I think it was one of the most beautiful musical gifts that anybody has ever given me in my career, actually.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah, you made me feel nostalgic for that now. I was around about that point because I think I was presenting Morning on 3 around that same time. And I'm just going to throw in one very quick one of mine before we go back to Gareth, who's going to send us out with a fabulous memory of his. But talking about Radio 3, I have my letter here from Nicholas Kenyon from April 1992, having sent him in lots of ideas for what I thought they should do for young people on Radio 3. And he wrote back and said, I just caught up with your letter. Apologies for the delay. Very grateful for your ideas. Do please keep in touch. I hope that something will come of this as we look for an appropriate way of attracting a younger audience to Radio 3. And that letter was it. That's what started me on my new career. Having set out to be a composer and percussionist, I then ended up being a broadcaster because of that letter. I couldn't believe it. I thought it was going to be the Adrian Mole experience of writing to the BBC and getting a thanks but no thanks letter back. But I got that, and that inspired me anyway. I mean, and less than 2 years later, I was doing my daily program, Music Machine on Radio 3. So that's the letter that changed my life completely. Was receiving that amazing moment. So Gareth, come on, send us off with another lovely important moment.
Okay, well, it's kind of two moments in one, really, but it's from 2012, which was sort of an amazing year in so many ways, and also quite depressing. That you asked me earlier about how you keep things fresh. When you're playing doing the same thing over and over again, and there are times when you play repertoire that you just think, I really don't want to play this again. I mean, a few years ago, I quite happily, if I'd have had the original, all the scores of Mahler 1, and I could have destroyed them, I'd happily never play that piece again. But even when I was asked to dep in an orchestra, it's Mahler 1, I'd be like, no, I don't want to do that again. But another old warhorse is the Brahms Violin Concerto. And it's funny because the trouble is with these, particularly with concertos, I find that when they're done so much, soloists come along and they feel like they've got to do something, and they've got to do something that's different. And I remember actually doing it with Christian Tetzlaff a few years ago, and he actually kind of did what was just in the music, and it turns out it's really good like that, without having to do all the traditional writs and pull-ups and weird affectations that aren't actually in the score.
Right.
And and after a while you see it come up and think, oh God, we got to do that again. And of course, the people who think that more than anyone in the orchestra is the principal oboe, because of course there's that beautiful but very pearly solo at the beginning of the slow movement. And it's a funny thing, because I, even sitting next to an oboe player all that time, I'm just thinking I've got to creep in towards the end and weirdly suddenly finish their solo for them. Never quite understood that about that piece. But in 2012 we lost our principal oboe, Kieran Moore, who died after a long illness, and we sat next to each other for 10 years. And we were in New York, actually. I was with you, Tommy,
yes,
making a film about the book. And he'd been ill for quite some time, and we got news that morning, and we had a concert later that day that he'd passed away. And the Brahms Violin Concerto was on the program, and you could just see everybody think, oh God, we've got to play that, and the other principal oboe had to play it as well, and I felt sorry for him. And I wasn't actually in the piece, because we had both the principals on that tour, and I was in the audience in the rehearsal. Funnily enough, Charlotte, I actually really enjoy listening to the LSO in rehearsals as well, because it's often the only time I get to hear them. And Lenny, who was the chairman at the time, made this announcement, and there was just this awful sort of, that family feeling of losing somebody who was well loved in the orchestra. And then we had to play this piece. The orchestra had to play this piece, and it was in the rehearsal. In the concert, everybody's like focused, because it's, you have to keep your emotion, you have to be emotional in performance, but you have to always just retain that 1% of control, because too much and it's just embarrassing and it's not good. So it's a real balance, but that doesn't really necessarily apply in rehearsals. And I was sat in the auditorium, and it was awful. It was awful. So that it was a really difficult time, but it was kind of one of those moments where you just realize that music is a really important thing even for the people on stage, So when you hear players playing, it means something, not to everybody and not the same thing on every night, but all those players are real people, and they've all got real things going on in their lives. And on that evening, it was the same for all of us, and it was difficult. But the other thing that happened in 2012, of course, was the London Olympics. And, the LSO famously played the Mr. Bean. That's the bit that everybody remembers, and Simon Rattle as well. And of course, that was great fun. But the bit that meant the most to me was right at the beginning. There was a section. It was called Green and Pleasant. And it was a bit where we were all wandering around. There were sheep, there were farmers, and it was right at the beginning. And there was Nimrod playing in the background. Now, for weeks and weeks and weeks, the LSO Discovery program, the education program, which is a huge part of what the LSO does, was involved in that. And we work with lots of kids in East London boroughs, and particularly deprived areas. Many of them don't have access to county music services, and we've tried to fill the gap in some of those places. We do extra stuff, coaching sessions, and lots of them they don't have instruments and stuff like that. So it's quite an important thing, and it's something that all the players in the LSO are involved in. And they wanted an orchestra to play of kids, so there was like a half of the LSO and half of these kids, and some of them were like about 4 foot high with what it turns out weren't cellos, were in fact violins. And the orchestra in that section, we all had to wear tails, and they'd all had these special tailcoats made, and then baseball boots of different colors. And we all started, and we had all these rehearsals, we did workshops in their groups, they came in, we learnt it, and of course in the end there was that whole thing, they're miming. It's like, well, I mean, pity the sound engineer that had to mic up the Olympic Stadium for performance. But the best thing was they all trooped in one day to Abbey Road Studios and recorded Enigma variations for this thing, and then we all had to play it on the day, and we were all playing, but of course you couldn't hear it, as it were. But the important thing is that we and the kids, we were playing in the final, and we had little earpieces in, and somebody was saying, right, move to your positions now. So we sat down, and then he said, okay, we're going to go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you're now live to 6 billion people. It was one of those. And we played this stuff, and I looked around. It was one of those moments in my life where I thought, I have to remember this, because I'm never going to play to that many people, even just in the stadium, and all the seats were lit up. And it was amazing time. It was when it was actually really great being British, when it felt like the world had come to us and we weren't shutting everybody out. And it was a really exciting thing to be involved in. And it's funny because throughout my time in the LSO, I've always tried to not be too cynical and not take things for granted, and sometimes the weird little things are the important things, and it's not the big grandstand concerts. Now this was the ultimate grandstand concert, but one of the kids sat next to me. We finished playing, and we had to sit there for about 5 minutes while the cameras weren't on us, and then we had to pick up our chairs and run, and then stop so we didn't get run over by the nurses with their beds going past at full pelt. And we were just sitting there, and he just turned to me and he said, I think this is the best day of my life. And I thought, you know what, it's pretty high up there for me as well. And that moment, there's this kid who's like just from somewhere in East London who's just doing this, and there's me, and I'm in the LSO and everything, and we're just feeling exactly the same about this moment. And it just summed up everything with education that we do, and the important, and how important that music is, And we weren't, you couldn't even hear us. It was pre-recorded. But it was amazing. I'll never forget that.
I'm so pleased you picked that. I was half expecting you to pick the time I introduced you to Quincy Jones, and you are
that was the next one.
Simply the most excited person I've ever seen, and in any moment ever in my life. But that's for another day. I think.
Story he told me about Stravinsky. I mean, unprintable.
Yeah, absolutely. Always. But thank you so much. It's been a lovely sort of trip down memory lane, really, to talk about these key moments in all our lives. Thanks ever so much, as always, to Richard and Charlotte, and especially to you, Gareth, for joining us today. Real pleasure. And of course, people can see you on camera with the LSO's various streaming concerts that have been going on now for quite some time, and will continue to do so, of course, as we still are in lockdown. Thanks ever so much, Gareth, for joining us. And thank you all for listening. Quick mention that you can now follow us on Twitter. It's 6 months late in the program. Sorry about that, but there we are. You can get all the latest news on the podcast, guest announcements, weekly polls. Do follow us at Classical Top 5. And there's always our Facebook page as well, of course. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please do rate us highly, obviously, as that really does help us get more visible and attract more listeners. Thanks so much to those of you that have done that already. We really appreciate it. Next week, we have the cellist Stephen Isserlis, who will be choosing his top 5 cello concertos. Very much looking forward to that. And also, before then, look out for another in our occasional series of Classical Top 5 special editions. This time, I'll be talking to the former King's singer, conductor, and much-loved broadcaster Brian Kay, who has just published his memoirs, which are full of wonderful stories from over 50 years in music. He'll be picking 5 of those favourite moments in that career for us. Really looking forward to that too. But for now, thanks for listening. Goodbye.